Hi, everyone. I wanted to talk to you a little bit today about I think, one of the most interesting topics with regard to the ancient world, and that is the question about the birth of Christianity. So we've been looking at the ancient world quite a bit here, looking at the ancient Near East, particularly ancient Israel, and looked at the Greeks for a little while, and we spent some time also looking at the ancient Romans. And we could spend a lot of time looking at the Romans, but I think one of the most important parts of Roman history is this part right around the time of Caesar Augustus, and it's connected to the birth of Christ and the beginnings of the Christian church in the Roman Empire. I think it's important to note, of course, that Christianity gets its start on the canvas of the Roman Empire. You have, starting in Jerusalem, the time of Jesus and the apostles, and eventually, within a couple of centuries, the church and the gospel is spread all throughout the map of the Mediterranean Sea. And so this is the place where Christianity emerges. Jesus is born, after all, when Caesar Augustus is the emperor. He dies when Tiberius is the emperor. And so this canvas, this Roman Empire, is the canvas upon which Christianity begins and also thrives in its early years. So I think it's important to take a look at this. As you may know, the beginnings, of course, with Christianity start in Jerusalem, but very quickly, by the middle or so of the 2nd century, the geographic center of the Christian church moves to Rome as the gospel kind of spreads beyond its early Jewish community into the broader community of the Gentiles. In the early days of Christianity, there were a number of really important dioceses that made up what was called early on the Catholic Church. And these dioceses included, of course, Jerusalem as the founding diocese where Jesus and the apostles were. But it also included some other important dioceses that are on this map. One, of course, was in Antioch, which is in Syria. And I'm having you read as one of the primary sources the work of Ignatius of Antioch. Ignatius was a bishop of Antioch. Antioch, of course, was founded by the Apostle Peter in the book of Acts. But these letters that Ignatius left to us are really quite interesting, and I would encourage you to take a look at those. And he is writing these letters on his way to Rome, actually, to be put to death. And so they're a very interesting window into the early days of Christianity. Other dioceses here included Alexandria in northern Egypt, Rome, of course, and Constantinople, which was a diocese, essentially founded by Constantine. All of these dioceses have ancient history to them. The Alexandrian Church, this is the Church of the Coptics, and the Antiochian Christians, and in some sense, these are communities that are still in the news because they've been persecuted greatly in recent years. So Alexandria, Jerusalem, Antioch in Syria, Constantinople, and of course Rome being one of the most important dioceses because this was where both Peter and Paul founded a church. And so again, the Roman Empire is the place where all of this is taking place. And as I record this, of course, Pope Francis is visiting the United States for the next week or so. So I think this is particularly interesting because of all the things that we study in the context of the ancient world, so much of this stuff is found in museums and in archaeological sites. But in a very real sense, what you have with the person of the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, is a living connection to the ancient world. When you see him walking around the streets, he's wearing, in a sense, Roman garb. And so it's a very, very interesting thing that this is a living connection that we have to the past in a way that's not quite the same when you visit ancient archaeological sites or the remnants of ancient Rome or Greece in museums. So I wanted to start this off then by talking about a couple of things connected to the life of Jesus. Now, many of these things you're already familiar with, so I'm not going to go into great detail here. But of course, Jesus was a Palestinian Jew, and we have a number of extra biblical sources for the life of Christ. Our most important sources are friendly sources, and they come from the Bible, the Gospels and the letters of Paul and the epistles and whatnot. But I did want to mention that we have quite a few extra, that means outside the Bible, sources for the life of Jesus. These would include sources like Suetonius, a Roman historian who wrote a biography of Augustus Caesar. They would include Tacitus, who was a Silver Age Roman historian. This would include even a Jewish author, a guy by the name of Josephus, who wrote a number of histories in these early days and mentions the early Christian community. So I mention that simply because there's really no dispute about the historicity of Jesus, and it is important to note that sources outside the Bible do, in fact, mention his life. Now, when you read these extra biblical sources, they tell us very little about who Jesus was. They tell us that he, had this band of followers, that he preached a message about the coming of the kingdom of God and the need for repentance. And it's a very, very basic kind of message that's connected, as you might expect, with the Jewish prophetic tradition from the Old Testament, right on up until the time of John the Baptist. So we don't know a whole lot about Jesus from these extra biblical sources, and our main source for the life of Jesus comes from the stories that we see in the Gospels. But he did have this small band of Jewish followers, and of course, as many of us know, he was crucified around 29 A.D. by the practice of Roman crucifixion. Now, this particular slide shows a kind of a romantic Renaissance rendition of crucifixion. Crucifixion was something that was gruesome and a horrible way to die, and the Romans used this kind of, torture, execution style if they wanted to make a statement, a political statement. And so they used crucifixion particularly with political rebels, of which Jesus really was considered to be, because you remember that one of the accusations made against Jesus was that he was the king of the Jews. And this is one of the things that the Romans didn't really tolerate, was political competition. So the Romans, despite what you see in the movies, were a very relatively tolerant people. They wouldn't have been able to conquer the Mediterranean world without being somewhat tolerant of the indigenous cultures that they conquered. But one of the things that they didn't put up with was any kind of threat of political competition. So when Jesus gets hailed as a potential king, or he speaks about the coming kingdom, these are sorts of things that would have threatened the Romans, and so that's part of the accusations that were made against him. If you'd like a good indication of what crucifixion was potentially like, I'd recommend, some of you have seen this, I'm sure, but the film by Mel Gibson called The Passion of the Christ. It's a film that I watch on a fairly regular basis, and it's not quite as romantic as this image that you see here. But it was a horrible way to die. Crucifixion, by the way, was something that was initially started, we learn about this from the ancient Persians, who used to use pikes as a way to crucify people who got into big trouble. Now, one of the most important points that I want to make with this topic here is the importance of the Jewish roots of Christianity. So Christianity really does have its roots and its source within the context of the Jewish community. It's very, very difficult to understand Christianity apart from this Jewish context. And what's interesting is you read in the textbook about early persecutions of the church. As long as the church stayed under the umbrella, as long as these early Christians stayed under the umbrella of Judaism, they were by and large off the radar of the Roman authorities. And in its early days, some scholars have said that Christianity is a cult or a sect within Judaism, and I think that's probably an appropriate way to view it. But by, the beginning of the 2nd century, as the church starts to move away from its Jewish roots, particularly in light of the rejection of Christ by Jews, the church becomes a target for emperors who are trying to figure out why things are going so badly in their empire. And this is particularly true in the late 2nd and 3rd centuries within the Roman Empire, where the empire falls into some pretty serious conflict internally, and emperors are looking for an explanation for this. And the person the group that sticks out most to these emperors are the Christians, who seem to be bucking the Roman system and probably annoying the gods, and therefore they should be stamped out. But the point is here, these Jewish roots of Christianity are very, very significant, and we shouldn't underestimate how important this is. Christians, of course, believe that Jesus was the fulfillment of the Hebrew promises of the coming Messiah or anointed one. And the New Testament conflicts that we see in the scriptures, in the epistles of Paul and the book of Acts and various other texts of the New Testament, these conflicts over things like dietary laws and circumcision and practices like that, these conflicts can only be understood in light of this Jewish context. I mean, we don't argue about these things anymore because our version of Christianity is now 2,000 years old. But in the early days, given its Jewish context, people did have a number of conflicts related to keeping Jewish feasts and laws and things like that. And the early church had to work that out. The other thing that's important to note is that the early church was organized much like a Jewish synagogue. So that too is something to keep in mind. Things like prayer and the reading of Scripture and the explanation of Scripture, all of these sort of basic elements that we expect to see in any church worship service. These are things that are definitely coming out of that Jewish synagogue tradition. So that's another important thing to keep in mind. So the Jewish roots here of Christianity are absolutely essential in terms of understanding what this faith is all about. However, by the early 2nd century, and by 2nd century, of course, I mean the 100s, by the early to mid 2nd century, you definitely see a clear break with Judaism. After all, the mission to the Jews was ultimately a failure. Although the early Christians preached Christianity to the Jews and preached Jesus as the fulfillment of this promised Messiah from long ago, the Jews ultimately rejected that. And so the mission of the church turns then to the Gentiles, the Goyim, if you will, the nations, that is, anyone else who is not who's not a Jew. That's where the mission starts to turn. And when this takes place, beginning in the middle of the 2nd century, or even the early part of the 2nd century, a number of questions start to emerge. How can Jews and Gentile Christians get along and live together? This was a really important point, because if you remember, in looking at Hebrew religion was something that was both universal but also separatist. And the Jews weren't allowed to intermarry with Gentiles. They weren't even allowed really to eat with them. I mean, it was a very sort of separatist world. And so when you have throngs of Gentiles coming into this Hebrew sect or this Jewish sect, it's going to bring up a bunch of questions about how these two groups of people that had traditionally been separate, how they were going to get along. You can remember, for example, the story of the Samaritan woman in the Gospels. And this woman is kind of shocked that Jesus would be coming to her and talking to her. I mean, this was not something that you were supposed to do. And Jesus is, in a way, kind of breaking the rules here. So this was definitely a mindset that needed to be overcome. And it was not something that would be overcome overnight. Today, the church is largely Gentile, and this would have taken some time to work all of this out. And as you can probably guess, the person who's most responsible for this was a guy named Paul of Tarsus. And you can find his very interesting conversion story in the book of Acts. And Paul of Tarsus was a Hellenized Jew, and of course he evangelized. He went on a number of these missionary trips throughout Greece and Asia Minor. And his most important contribution was that he helped to create a theology for Gentile Christianity. He helped to create a theology for Gentile Christianity. He's the person who, in a way, worked out some of these questions regarding the relationship between the Gentile communities and the church. And he did this in particular with regard to some major practices that were expected by the Jews. For example, circumcision was something that it was a sign of the covenant, and Jews were expected to participate in this at a very young age. Dietary laws, temple worship, sacrifices, these kinds of things were all expected by Jews to perform. And so, as these Gentiles start to come into the church, the big question is, do you have to be a Jew first in order to become a Christian? Does that make sense? If you're a Gentile, the question is, do you have to become a Jew first? Do you have to get circumcised, for example? Do you have to keep dietary laws, et cetera, until you do that, you really can't become a Christian, as it were. And Paul and the apostles helped people to appreciate the fact that this was not something that was necessary. After all, the covenant sign for Christianity is not circumcision anymore, it's baptism, right? And so when I was talking about Hebrew religion on an earlier screencast, I talked about the way in which Jesus fulfilled many of these promises and many of these practices and beliefs in the Old Testament. He was the fulfillment of many of these Old Testament beliefs. And Christians believe this. And so, there's no more sacrificing of animals anymore, because now you have, the body and blood of Christ, which feeds his people, just as the manna in the wilderness fed the ancient Israelites. So Paul helps the church and the apostles even to understand this theology for Gentile Christianity. You might recall one of the great first council in the book of Acts, where Paul and the apostles are wrestling with these kinds of questions. And they draw up a letter, and the letter gets sent out. It's an authoritative letter that gets sent out that basically says, no, you don't have to become a Jew in order to become a Christian. So Paul plays a very important role in these early days to kind of sort some of these issues out. Another thing I wanted to mention here briefly has to do with the organization of the early church and of early Christianity. And in particular, I wanted to talk about a couple of things here: the role of heresy and this threefold ministry of the church, the formation of the canon of the New Testament, and the creed. Let me start by saying a couple of things about the role of heresy. Now, heresy is one of these ideas that we really don't talk about very much these days. We live in a world that's so religiously diverse, even among Christians, that the word heresy is not thrown around too much for fear of offending someone or some group of people. So it's not a term that's used very regularly in terms of our own vocabulary, but in the early days of Christianity, heresy and orthodoxy, heterodoxy and orthodoxy, these were words that were used and were understood. There was a right way to think, orthodoxy, and there was a wrong way to think, heterodoxy or heresy. And these two concepts, heresy and orthodoxy, tended to have a kind of symbiotic relationship between the two. In other words, they fed off of each other. One didn't know what was wrong until one first understood what was right, and one didn't understand what was right until one understood what was wrong. And so I think it's a really important point to keep in mind that that as you begin to see the early church wrestle with various heretical views, what they believe to be heretical views, it is in this context of debating with and arguing with and trying to understand these heretical movements that the formation of early Christian theology begins to emerge. Okay? So theology is not something, and our belief system is not something that's created in a vacuum. And it's not something that's created simply by, proof texting a Bible verse from the Gospels or the epistles. It's created in the context of historical dialogue. Okay? And there are a number of these heresies that pop up, but I wanted to mention a couple. One I would mention is the heresy of Donatism. Now, there were times in the early church, particularly in the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries, where the church experienced some pretty severe empire-wide persecutions, particularly under the Emperor Decius. And during these persecutions, there were times when Christians, priests or bishops, denied the faith. You can imagine, the authorities come in with their weapons and they demand that Christians turn over their books and, disband their organization and whatnot, threatened with, persecution and potentially death. And it should not surprise us that some people weren't particularly keen on that idea. And for reasons that are not always clear, they handed over the books. They in a sense denied the faith. Remember, even the great St. Peter did this as well. And so it's, lest we think too ill of these folks, it's something that, none of us have really been tested on. But anyway, these people who denied the faith later on, particularly after the persecutions died down, wanted to be able to come back into the church and serve and function in their former capacity. And some people, the Donatists, said, no, you can't do that. If you've committed some kind of immoral act, the sacraments that you perform, and sacraments, of course, would be things like baptism or marriage or the Eucharist or ordinations, things like that these sacraments were invalid. In other words, the immorality of a priest or a bishop had a direct relationship to the way in which God was able to communicate his grace to people. Sacraments are vehicles of communication of God's grace, okay? So the immorality of a priest or a bishop would negate the ability for that priest or bishop to function sacramentally. Well, on one hand, that sort of makes sense. The idea that, a priest does something bad or is immoral in any way, the kind of human side of us says, yes, that person is therefore disqualified, and whatever he's able to do as a priest or a pastor or a bishop, that just can't happen anymore. But in consultation with and in thinking through this issue of Donatism, the Donatists were the ones that said, these sacraments are not valid if they're administered by an immoral priest. In context with or in communication with and in dialogue with the Donatists, the church decided that was not true, that God's grace can in fact work and can in fact be communicated even through unclean vessels, even through priests or bishops who do immoral or bad things. So it's an important, subtle, but very important theological point that's being made here, in this case with regard to the sacraments of the church and how they function. And the idea is that God is greater than the immorality of a priest or a bishop. And so God is perfectly able to communicate his grace and get the job done, even when that job is being filtered through someone who is, in effect, unclean. I hope that makes some sense. And I think for people who follow the Christian faith, this is a big relief, actually, because human beings are, well, sinful. And so from a theological standpoint, this does, when you think about it, it does actually make some sense. So this was a heresy that was condemned, but it's in that dialogue with the Donatists that the church was able to tighten up their understanding of the sacraments and how the sacraments work and how God works through these sacraments. Another heresy that I think is worth mentioning here, and this is in your textbook a little bit, so I'd refer you to that to take a look at this, but another heresy in this regard is the heresy of Arianism. And this was a heresy that sort of came from a North African priest named Arius, actually. And this was a heresy that taught that Jesus was a created being and therefore, in some respects, inferior to God. This was a widely held view, particularly in the Byzantine territories. Constantine, the Emperor Constantine, had to deal with this on a fairly regular basis. So it was a really important heresy that did, in fact, threaten the church for many, many, many years. And so there was a lot of dialogue with this particular heresy. In fact, if you read the New Testament carefully, you can find evidence that would support this view about Arianism. There are passages, for example, in Colossians, where Paul says that Jesus is the firstborn of all creation. So he's a created being. You can see how that interpretation could easily be made from one of the passages in the letters of Paul, or even Jesus himself, when in the Gospels occasionally he'll say, there are things that the Father in heaven knows, but I don't know them, particularly in reference to the end times and all of that. So one could make the case simply from proof texting certain Bible passages that, this view of Arius kind of makes sense. But it was a view that was condemned at the Council of Nicaea in 325 because the church believed and still believes that Jesus is fully God, as well as being completely human. So once again, and there are others too, we could talk about Gnosticism was another important early Christian heresy. But the point here is that heresy, this dialogue with these various heretical groups that crop up in the early years of the Christian church, really helped the church to formulate its thinking regarding some very, very basic ideas surrounding things like the nature of God, the nature of Christ, the Last Judgment, etc., etc. You find these statements, by the way, in the early Christian creeds, which is another couple of sources that I'm asking you to look at this week. For example, here's a section of the Nicene Creed from 325. Now, this is a creed that many Christian churches quote every day or every week as part of their worship. But you can look at the language here. We believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of all things visible and invisible. Now, I didn't talk about Gnosticism, but this is a statement that's directly against the early Gnostic heretics who believed in a dualistic God, a God who created heaven. One God created the heavens and the invisible things, and then another God created the visible things. And the Nicene Creed wants to make it clear that it's one God who created everything. And in one Lord Jesus Christ, the Son of God, begotten of the Father, and then notice the language here, God of God, light from light, true God from true God, begotten, not made, being of one essence, or consubstantial is the current way that the Nicene Creed is quoted, consubstantial, or being of one essence with the Father. This is very, very clear statement against the Arian heretics who thought that Jesus was somehow inferior to God. So these early creeds, I'd encourage you to take a look at these. The Nicene Creed and the Apostles' Creed really help us to understand how that early Christian church formulated some of the most basic theological understandings that come down to us to the present. The Nicene Creed and the Apostles' Creed, these were authoritative creeds, and they were, in a way, a litmus test for one's orthodoxy, that is, right belief. If you believed the Nicene Creed, if you followed the tenets of the Nicene Creed, you were part of the Orthodox Catholic Church. If you were not, if you did not believe these things, you were considered to be outside of that particular communion. So these creeds became very authoritative right down to the present. They're used to this day to help people to understand what the church believes. And in fact, if you've ever had to take a catechism class, most of the time, the catechism, if you're from the Catholic tradition, for example, the Catechism of the Catholic Church is basically built around these early creeds, along with things like the Ten Commandments. So it's a really interesting point. These creeds become the basis for the subsequent development of Christian theology in the West. Now, I want to mention a couple of other institutions here that are really important. One of them has to do with the so-called threefold ministry of the church. From the very earliest days, the church was divided into three basic ministry offices, and those were deacons, elders, or they were sometimes called priests, and bishops. At the top of this hierarchy were the bishops. And to this day, the bishops are the pastors of a local church. That church might be a rather large chunk of geography. It might be a small chunk of geography, but they are ultimately the pastors of the church. They're responsible for everything that happens within their diocese. They are, in effect, the CEO of the diocese. And the priest, or the elders, the priests in the church, function under the bishop. And this has always been the case. They work for the bishop, and their duties are performed in the name of the bishop. And deacons also function as a way to serve the priests. And so these three offices were very, very stable. And as I said, they come down to us to the present. I don't know of any Christian church that doesn't at least have deacons. But most churches, even Protestant churches, will have some sort of form of this threefold ministry of the church. And this institution provided some stability for the early church. And when big disputes took place, the bishops, these leaders, would get together, they would discuss them. And I mentioned earlier the 5 dioceses of the early Christian church. Of those 5 dioceses, there seems to have been some preeminence given from the early days to the Diocese of Rome. That Rome had a kind of preeminence among the other dioceses. They were given, the Bishop of Rome was a bishop just like any other bishop, but he was given some preeminence in the sense that, this was a very special diocese because it was founded by both the Apostle Peter and the Apostle Paul. So the threefold ministry provided some real stability in the church, and it was important for the early Christians that they could trace the lineage of their bishops back to the original apostles. We call this apostolic succession, but this was particularly true for the Bishop of Rome. And so being able to trace the lineage, the spiritual lineage, not bloodlines here, but the spiritual lineage of the Bishop of Rome, all the way back, in this case, to the Apostle Peter. This was something that was important. And so that's why I said earlier, when the Pope is here in the United States, as he is right now, it is an interesting thing to contemplate that, here you have the person who is standing as the direct spiritual heir in terms of his office of St. Peter himself. It's a pretty cool thing to think about. But this was really important. This apostolic succession was really important because you remember, if you read in the Nicene Creed, one of the comments or one of the statements there is, we believe in one holy, Catholic, and apostolic church. And that apostolic mark of the church was this, that it connected the bishops of the church all the way back to the ancient apostles. The other institution that proved some stability here was the creation of the New Testament canon. And as you can imagine, there were lots and lots of books that were floating around the ancient world. And if you wanted to have a bestseller, you could write a book and sign it the Apostle Paul, or even sign it Jesus, and you could probably get some attention. So the church had to wrestle with the question of what are the right books that should be part of this canon, this collection of New Testament books. And I will tell you that it took until roughly the 4th century for the church to finally work this out, what the canon would be. There were a number of gospels floating around in addition to the ones that we currently have in the New Testament. Gospels like the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, which was a Gnostic text that was used, and the Gospel of Thomas is another one. If any of you are familiar with some of the Dan Brown work that's been popularized in recent years, both in books and in films, many of these are based on some of those Gnostic texts. So the church had to wrestle with what books were in, what books were out. Same was true with some of the Pauline epistles, or the other epistles in the New Testament. There was the Apocalypse of Peter, for example. We have in our canon the Apocalypse of John, the book of Revelation. But there were other similar books floating around, and the church had to wrestle with these. So again, there's a historic decision-making process that doesn't just simply happen overnight, and it's something that takes some time for the church to work out. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. But this also provided that stability. In addition to apostolic succession, what are the right books that Christians should have? And then I already mentioned the creed a little bit, but the creed helped to define right belief. This is what Christians believe. And so these institutions, these early institutions, which were established very, very early, and you'll see some evidence of this as you read even in the letter of St. Ignatius to the Romans. These three institutions, the threefold ministry, the canon, and the creed, all helped the early Christians to sort out what was the right church and what was the wrong church. So you can imagine if you were a Christian living in the year 200 or so, you would have had some competing voices out there for what the Christian church was. How could you sort that out? Well, you sorted that out by asking these kinds of questions. Could you trace the lineage of your bishop back to the early apostles? If you could, that's good. If you couldn't, that's a problem. What books were you using in your liturgies? Were you reading from the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, or were you using, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? And what creed were you using? Were you using the Apostles' Creed or the Nicene Creed? These institutions helped to provide the early church with that kind of stability that would last a very, very long time and really help the church deal with all the sorts of problems that it might face down the road. So I hope this will help a little bit to give you a bit of a context for the readings that you're going to have to do in this week, and I really encourage you to get into these sources a little bit and to pay attention to them. They're pretty interesting, some pretty interesting stuff there. If you have any questions, obviously, post these on the discussion forum, and we can take it from there. But for now, thanks for listening, and I hope you all have a great day.